The most profitable business model in history wasn't invented by a tech company. It wasn't created by oil barons or banking dynasties. It was perfected by a government that discovered something far more valuable than selling products: the ability to own an entire economy without calling it theft. For nearly 2 centuries, Britain didn't just trade with India. It restructured India's economy so thoroughly that every transaction, every harvest, every bolt of cloth sold generated wealth that flowed in only one direction: out. This wasn't colonialism as most people imagine it. This was something more sophisticated, more devastating, and far more profitable. Welcome to The Economic Historian, where ambition builds empires and truth demands a price. Act 1. The setup. The economy that existed. Before Britain arrived, India wasn't a pristine paradise waiting to be civilized. It was one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. In 1700, India produced roughly 23% of global GDP. Its textile industry was the most advanced in the world. Indian cotton was finer than European cloth. Indian dyes were more vibrant. Indian craftsmanship was unmatched. European markets were flooded with Indian goods: calicos, muslins, chintz. These weren't luxury novelties. They were superior products that Europeans couldn't replicate and desperately wanted. Bengal alone exported textiles worth millions of pounds annually. It was one of the world's busiest ports. Indian merchants operated sophisticated credit networks spanning continents. Banking systems existed that would look familiar to modern financiers. India wasn't backward, it was competitive, economically dominant even. And that was the problem. Because Britain wasn't interested in competing, it was interested in controlling. And control required something more permanent than military occupation. It required restructuring incentives. The mechanism began. The transformation didn't start with an invasion, it started with a corporation. The British East India Company arrived in India as a trading entity in the early 1600s. For decades, it functioned like any merchant operation, buying goods, shipping them to Europe, selling at profit. But trade had a frustrating limitation. You had to pay for what you bought. Indian merchants demanded silver. European goods weren't competitive. Britain was hemorrhaging precious metals to finance its addiction to Indian textiles. The trade imbalance was unsustainable. So the company stopped thinking like a merchant and started thinking like a state. The shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The company secured trading rights, then it negotiated tax exemptions, then it acquired small territories, then it built armies to protect those territories, then it used those armies to acquire more territory. By the mid-18th century, the East India Company had done something unprecedented. It had become a military power that happened to sell textiles. And in 1757, everything changed. The Battle of Plassey. At Plassey, a small military engagement in Bengal, the company defeated the Nawab of Bengal through the combination of bribery, betrayal, and a few thousand soldiers. The battle itself was almost irrelevant. What mattered was what came after. The company didn't just win territory, it won the right to collect taxes. This is where the innovation happened. The moment the company gained tax collection authority, it stopped being a business operating inside an economy. It became the economy. And once you control the tax system, you control everything. Act 2. The extraction machine. How the system worked. Here's what most history books miss. Britain didn't get rich by stealing India's gold. It got rich by restructuring how value flowed through India's economy. The mechanism was elegant in its brutality. First, the company imposed land taxes. These weren't negotiated tributes. They were fixed, inflexible demands set in British currency, payable regardless of harvest quality, drought, or famine. Farmers who had operated on subsistence agriculture for generations suddenly needed cash. Not surplus, cash. Every year, without exception. To get cash, they sold crops, but they couldn't sell at market rates because the company controlled the markets. So farmers sold cheap. The company bought cheap, then the company exported those goods to Britain and global market prices and pocketed the difference. But it gets worse, because the company didn't just tax land, it restructured production. India's textile industry was the crown jewel of its economy. British merchants had spent a century trying to compete and failing. So Britain stopped competing. It destroyed the competition. The company began imposing tariffs on Indian textiles entering Britain, tariffs so high that Indian cloth became unaffordable in British markets. Meanwhile, British textiles entering India faced no such barriers. Indian weavers who had supplied global markets for centuries suddenly couldn't access their largest customer base. Their prices collapsed. At the same time, the company began demanding taxes be paid in cash, not goods. Weavers needed money. The only buyers offering money were company agents, who paid below market rates. Within decades, millions of Indian weavers were driven out of business.
This wasn't market competition, this was policy-driven demolition. And the wealth generated, it didn't stay in India. It couldn't, because the entire system was designed to ensure it flowed outward. The drain. Economists call it the drain of wealth. The term sounds abstract, the reality was specific. Every rupee collected in taxes left India and arrived in Britain as profit. The company didn't reinvest in Indian infrastructure. It didn't build schools, roads, or hospitals with that money. It shipped it to London. The goods produced in India, cotton, indigo, opium, tea, grain, were purchased with tax money extracted from Indian farmers, then sold in global markets. The profits returned to British shareholders. India was paying for its own exploitation. Even when India imported British goods, it was often paying for those imports with wealth Britain had already extracted. Britain sold textiles to India, bought with money taxed from Indian farmers, made from cotton grown in India, and shipped back to India at marked-up prices. The circle was perfect, self-reinforcing, and deliberately engineered. By the mid-19th century, British officials openly acknowledged this. One colonial administrator wrote, "India is to be bled, not developed, not partnered with, bled," and bleed it did. Between 1765 and 1947, India experienced over 27 major famines. Some killed millions. These weren't natural disasters, they were policy outcomes. During the Bengal famine of 1770, approximately 10 million people died, 1/3 of Bengal's population. Crops had failed, yes, but the famine was made catastrophic by company policy. The company continued exporting grain even as people starved. Why? Because grain was taxable, because contracts had to be honored, because shareholders expected returns. Famine relief would have reduced profit margins. So the company did nothing, and when pressed, it blamed Indian farmers for not adapting to market conditions. This pattern repeated throughout British rule. During the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878, grain was exported from India while millions starved. During the Bengal famine of 1943, yes, 1943 during World War II, grain was diverted to support the war effort while between 2 and 3 million Indians died. The system treated human life as externality. The only inputs that mattered were extraction rates and cost efficiency. And the longer the system ran, the more permanent it became.
Act 3, the sophistication, infrastructure as extraction. Here's where the story gets more uncomfortable. Britain did build infrastructure in India, railways, telegraphs, ports, irrigation systems. Defenders of the British Empire point to this constantly. Look at what Britain gave India, they say. But infrastructure isn't neutral, it serves purposes. And in India, every railway, every port, every telegraph line was built to serve one purpose, more efficient extraction. Railways didn't connect Indian cities for Indian benefit. They connected resource-producing regions to ports, coal from mines, cotton from fields, tea from plantations, all moving in one direction, out. The Indian railway system by the early 20th century was one of the largest in the world. It was also one of the most profitable for British investors because the railways were financed through Indian taxes, built using Indian labor, and guaranteed returns by the British government. The risk was socialized, the profit was privatized. When railways didn't generate sufficient revenue, the shortfall was covered by Indian taxpayers. When they exceeded expectations, British shareholders collected dividends. India paid for the infrastructure, Britain collected the returns, and the infrastructure itself accelerated resource extraction. This is the sophistication that makes British rule different from simple plunder. Plunder is finite. You steal what exists and leave. Britain restructured incentives so that value generation itself flowed outward continuously without requiring overt theft. Currency manipulation went deeper. Britain tied Indian currency to the British pound. Exchange rates were set in London. Indian monetary policy was controlled by British officials. This meant that when Britain needed to finance wars, the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, World War I, it could extract resources from India simply by manipulating exchange rates. During World War I, India contributed over 1 million soldiers and vast financial resources. It wasn't framed as extraction, it was framed as obligation. India's contribution to Britain's war efforts exceeded £100 million. India received no compensation. Instead, Indian taxes increased to cover the costs of Indian participation. India was paying Britain to use Indian soldiers in British wars. And after World War I, when global economies struggled with debt, Britain resolved part of its obligation by devaluing Indian currency. Indian savings lost value. British debts became cheaper to service. The loss was absorbed by Indians. The relief was enjoyed by Britain. By the 20th century, the narrative had shifted. British officials no longer described their role in India as extraction. They described it as development, civilization, progress. Schools were built, but they taught British history and British values. Legal systems were established, but they prioritized British commercial interests. Administration was modernized, but Indians were excluded from senior positions. The language changed, the structure didn't. And this is where the system reveals its most enduring trick. It convinced even its victims that the exploitation was necessary. military, that it was education, that it was modernization. Indians who resisted were labeled backwards. Those who adapted were rewarded with marginal inclusion. The system created complicity through incentive, not just force, and by the time independence arrived, the damage was structural. Act 4, the cost, the numbers. Quantifying extraction is difficult, but economists have tried. Conservative estimates suggest Britain extracted between $15 and $45 trillion from India over 2 centuries, adjusted for current value. To put that in perspective, that's roughly double the current GDP of the United States, extracted from a single colony. India's share of global GDP collapsed from 23% in 1700 to less than 4% by 1950. Life expectancy dropped, literacy stagnated, industrial capacity declined. By the time Britain left, India was one of the poorest countries on Earth. This wasn't inevitable, it was engineered. And when Britain finally granted India independence in 1947, it didn't leave behind a functional economy, it left behind wreckage. Partition divided the country, infrastructure was split, industries were outdated, institutions were designed for extraction, not governance. India inherited an economy optimized for someone else's benefit, and Britain left with no reparations owed, no debt acknowledged, no compensation paid. Instead, India was presented with a bill. Debts incurred during British rule, debts taken on by British administrators for British priorities, were transferred to the newly independent Indian government. India's first act as a free nation was inheriting Britain's liabilities. The system had been so thoroughly designed that even independence couldn't immediately escape it. Act 5, the pattern. Why this matters today. This isn't ancient history. The logic Britain perfected in India didn't disappear with independence, it evolved. Modern economic systems still operate on the same core mechanics. Control the rules, extract the value, distribute the costs. When international financial institutions impose structural adjustment programs on developing nations, requiring privatization, austerity, and market liberalization, that's not colonialism, but the incentives are strikingly familiar. When multinational corporations operate in countries with weak regulatory systems, when profits are repatriated while environmental costs remain local, when tax havens allow wealth extraction without legal accountability, you're seeing echoes of the same structure, not as direct as British rule, but functionally similar. The difference is complexity. The system is now mediated through institutions, treaties, and financial instruments. The language is cleaner, the violence is less visible, but the question remains the same. Who controls the rules and where does the value flow? The structural lesson. Understanding British rule in India isn't about assigning guilt. It's about recognizing patterns. Systems don't exploit accidentally. They exploit because incentives reward extraction and punish resistance. Britain didn't shatter India through violence alone. It shattered India by restructuring incentives so thoroughly that resistance became economically irrational. That's the lesson. Not that empires are evil, but that systems engineered for extraction don't require evil people to function. They just require complicity, inattention, and the belief that outcomes are natural rather than designed. Financial literacy isn't about predicting markets or choosing investments. It's about seeing structure, about recognizing when value flows in one direction by design, not accident. The British Empire understood this 200 years ago. That's what made it so effective, and that's why its shadow still stretches across the modern world. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.